Is the FBI corrupt?
Mr. Reagan.
About the current state of the FBI, I can only speculate. But if I were to speculate, I'd have to say, yes, the FBI is corrupt. After the FBI was exposed for spying on Trump during the 2016 election, it was clear that the FBI was corrupt. And the fact that Comey and Strzok and McCabe and everybody else involved, in that whole thing, the fact that none of them are in prison right now is a testament to just how much corruption there still is in Washington, D.C. But we also know that there's corruption because of how severely the FBI has gone after the January 6th protesters. And we now know that the FBI infiltrated and were probably controlling many of the very organizations that they're now claiming planned the so-called insurrection. But I'm going to dive into all of that in my next video. This video, the video you're watching right now, this is actually the first in a short series that I'm doing about the FBI. I recently started digging into the corruption in DC now that the Democrats have control, and I discovered that there is such a massive well of information that needs to be drawn up and exposed that I've divided it all up into 3 full videos. So if you want to know what's really going on in DC, well, I'm going to be exposing a lot of stuff in the next few videos, and I'm going to be speculating a lot as well about the stuff that I don't know. I'm going to try to put some of these pieces together. In one moment, first, of course, I have to sell you something. Diversifying your investment is like building a sports team. Each asset plays different roles. You have offensive players, assets that make gains and pay dividends, but equally important is your defensive line, assets that will protect the value of your investment. And there's a 5,000-year-old asset that's seen every world crisis that there ever was and thrived. Gold and other precious metals. The oldest hedge against inflation and disaster, your stability insurance. If you put gold into an IRA, you even defer the tax on all gains until you retire. So you get compound growth on everything. That can add thousands of dollars to your fund over the years. And you'd have stability, peace of mind that you made the right choice. Take out an IRA with Noble Gold this month, and along with first-class service, they'll be gifting you a 1/10 ounce gold bullion American Eagle coin. To find out more, go to their website, noblegoldinvestments.com, or call them at 877-646-5347. Again, noblegoldinvestments.com, or call them 877-646-5347. A couple of years ago, I was at CPAC, and I ran into a fan of my show. And this guy told me that he was a former FBI agent and that he was going to be doing a podcast of his own. Now, I run into people all the time who say that they're starting a YouTube channel or doing a podcast or something like that. And although I want to encourage everybody to express themselves, express any interesting or valuable ideas they might have about politics or about culture, I don't usually have a lot of time to listen to all these shows. But this guy, however, this guy was different. Former FBI. And he wasn't just former FBI. He worked in DC directly for Robert Mueller. This guy had the inside scoop. The man's show is called The Mark Vines Show. And he gave me his business card, and we went our separate ways. I left CPAC genuinely planning to watch this podcast, of course. But since that day at CPAC, I've dug into countless stories about Washington, D.C. Biden, Pelosi, AOC, China, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, the weather underground, the 2020 election, and various other cultural and political issues. But until recently, I had never remembered to check out The Mark Vines Show. And as I said at the top of the show, we all know the FBI was corrupted under James Comey, obviously. But I think a lot of folks believe that the corruption was entirely rooted out and removed when Comey and his crew left the FBI. But then January 6th happened. And since then, several of my friends have been questioned by the FBI. The FBI is targeting patriotic, law-abiding Americans simply for engaging in a constitutionally sanctioned political protest. And even more striking to me was the story that Patrick Byrne, the founder of Overstock.com, told in an interview last November. I posted that entire interview on my channel months ago, and I'll play a little bit of it later in this video too. But essentially, he revealed that the FBI has been gathering compromising information on powerful people in America, not to arrest them, not to punish them for their crimes, not to take dangerous criminals off the street and protect the innocent, not even to protect the integrity of our republic. No, they're collecting this compromising information in order to leverage these people, to extort them, to blackmail them, to control them. After seeing this video from Patrick Byrne, I started looking into the FBI. I started reading about the FBI. I met some other former agents. I spoke to my friends who'd been interrogated after January 6th, and I listened to the Mark Vines podcast. And let me tell you, this guy's podcast is fantastic. He interviews other former agents, and he really gets into the inter-office politics of the DC Bureau and how it's really degenerated in many ways from what it used to be when he joined, which was an agency that really tried to be apolitical, at least from his perspective. Now, there's a link to the Mark Vines podcast in the description below, so if you're interested in checking out this guy's show, I would highly recommend it. Now, what he says on the podcast is that the FBI used to be a law enforcement agency. That was their purpose. Investigate crime, arrest suspects, prosecute them, keep Americans safe. And the FBI used to be somewhat decentralized in that the various local departments had a lot of autonomy to investigate cases in their region. Robert Mueller changed all that. The FBI now has essentially become an intelligence agency.
The public has to understand that there is the pre-9/11 FBI and the post-9/11 FBI. The pre-9/11 FBI was really, the way I would describe it, is a law enforcement organization that dabbled in counterintelligence. Whereas today, it's basically an organization that is counterterrorism and counterintelligence and dabbles in law enforcement. And so it's a very, very big shift that's occurred. And that shift occurred under Robert Mueller. And what Mueller was trying to do was make the organization more intel-driven, more intel-based, understand that that was the mandate. And really, Mueller had to do that, or else Congress wanted the FBI just to be dismantled and torn apart.
What do intelligence agencies do? Well, they leverage people. That's it. I mean, aside from hacking, leveraging people is their primary technique for intelligence gathering. And traditionally, leveraging people is an effective technique, and it's a valuable tool to both law enforcement and intelligence agencies. But only when they're going after actual criminals or foreign intelligence. Say the CIA needs to know how much progress Iranian scientists have made in developing a nuclear weapon. Well, they might target a lab assistant with a gambling problem who has access to all the data they need. What they do is they make a deal to pay off the guy's gambling debts in exchange for the intel they need. Or let's say they nab a drug dealer. They can threaten him with a hefty prison sentence unless he cooperates in helping law enforcement take down his boss, or even the entire distribution network. I mean, this is stuff we've all seen a million times on TV shows and in movies. And, this kind of stuff will make sense to us, right? However, these techniques should only be used against criminals and foreign intelligence targets, not law-abiding American citizens. We're the folks that these agencies were designed to protect. But now, I think the guard dog has turned on its owner. According to Mark Vines, the FBI no longer give regional field offices much autonomy at all. They dictate everything from Washington, D.C. Robert Mueller wanted total control over the FBI, and so he centralized power at the federal level. He concentrated all the power with himself.
The way that Mueller did this was very top-down, very autocratic, very dictatorial. And anybody that knows Robert Mueller knows that that is his leadership style. Very dictatorial. Do as I say, not as I do, and don't question things. It became very apparent at that time that Robert Mueller within the organization was someone to be feared. Louis Freeh moved people from headquarters out into the field because he felt that headquarters was too top-heavy, the FBI was too autocratic and driven from the top, and Mueller wanted to reverse that. He believed in absolute control. So he wanted people back at headquarters, and he made a very, very, very top-heavy organization. And I believe that is the beginning of what has led to the problems that we are facing today with the organization.
So he not only turned the FBI into an intelligence agency, but he turned it into a more centralized one. You might call it a central intelligence agency. The CIA's purview is outside the United States. It targets foreigners. The FBI's purview is within the United States. So if the FBI becomes the CIA, we now have a CIA that targets Americans. Now, why is all of this a problem? Why is it a problem that Mueller centralized authority in Washington, D.C.? Well, everyone that I spoke to about being interviewed by the FBI after January 6th, they all said the same thing. They said that the agents interviewing them seemed to know that what they were doing was wrong. These were all local agents, patriots, good guys, and they all regretted the job that they were being forced to do. Now, my next video that I'm coming out with tomorrow, that's all about the FBI's involvement in January 6th, so I'm not going to get into that too much, but I will say this. I recently talked to a friend of mine, a friend who knows all the upper echelon of all the various January 6th protest groups, Three Percenters, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, etc. Now, I already knew that one of these organizations had been infiltrated at the top level by the FBI, that it was effectively controlled by the FBI. So I asked my friend how many of these organizations are infiltrated at the top level by the FBI, how many of them are controlled by the FBI. He answered with 3 simple words: all of them. The FBI is no longer sitting idly by waiting for crimes to be committed. They're triggering the crimes themselves. They're involved in blackmail and entrapment, and it appears that they are controlling hundreds, maybe thousands of powerful Americans. But it goes higher than militia groups and Trump supporters. Their ultimate plan for after the Obama years was to install a puppet president. This was, as I said earlier, revealed by Patrick Byrne in his interview last November. This interview was the single most explosive news story I have heard since the FBI were revealed to have illegally spied on the Trump campaign, and yet nobody covered this Patrick Byrne story. There was only a couple of places that you could have even heard this story, including my channel. Basically, the story is this. The FBI employed Patrick Byrne to facilitate an $18 million bribe to Hillary Clinton from a foreign actor. Byrne was, of course, wearing a wire recording the entire meeting. Now, here's the thing. Hillary took that bribe. And when Patrick Byrne asked the FBI what was going to happen to her, they said that she was going to become the next president. And they said that she would be controlled with this compromising evidence that Byrne had collected. Here's the interview.
I bribed Hillary Clinton $18 million. I facilitated a bribe for Hillary Clinton on January 14th, 2016, right here in this town, on behalf of the FBI. They came to me around December 1st, 2015. They told me Hillary Clinton had accepted a bribe from Turkey for $20 million. They told me that I would be working for a group in New York, FBI agents, who had authorization to set Hillary Clinton up in a sting. They asked me to facilitate a bribe for her, an $18 million bribe from another government. The bag man from that other government, I was to befriend, and I was to get that person 10 minutes alone in a room with Hillary Clinton. I did. On January 14th, 2016, Hillary Clinton was in this town, and she met in a way that was kept off her schedule. She accepted an $18 million bribe, and I worked with the FBI as I did that. They came to me 3 days later and told me I had to forget about it and forget that it ever happened. And I said, what are you talking about? And they gave me one excuse. They said, Hillary's going to win, and it's been determined, it's been decided upstairs, nothing's going to be able to stop that now. So she's going to win. We had almost a year before the election. They could have had me and another person in front of a grand jury in a week and gotten her indicted. And they told me, and this is the key to understanding what's happened in America. They told me, this is word for word, Patrick, what's really going on is this. President Obama has his people across the federal bureaucracy at this point, but especially the Department of Justice. Hillary Clinton is going to be president for 8 years, and nothing's going to change that. But think of there being a Bunsen burner within the Department of Justice. That evidence about the 2 bribes you were part of gathering is going to be sitting on the Bunsen burner. And the hand on the Bunsen burner is going to be one of Barack Obama's people. If Hillary's a good girl and defends Obamacare, that flame stays low. If she's a bad girl and thinks for herself, it's going to get turned up high. That way, Barack Obama is going to manage Hillary Clinton for the 8 years she's president, and then she's going to step down, and Michelle's going to run. And Patrick, that's the plan.
Now, Patrick Byrne says in that interview that the FBI told him that the plan was to have Barack Obama running things behind the scenes. And perhaps that was the plan. Or perhaps that was what certain agents were told the plan was. Or perhaps the FBI was just flat out lying about that part of it. But in any case, the FBI does have this compromising information on Hillary. And had she become president, they would have had total control over her. When Trump won the election, This completely derailed all of the FBI's plans. And so they had to pivot. And how did they pivot? Well, they conspired with Democrats in Congress to impeach Donald Trump. After that didn't work, Democrats began looking to the 2020 election to regain control. Now, from a philosophically left-wing perspective, there were several good candidates, far better than Joe Biden. Elizabeth Warren was popular with feminists. Bernie was popular among socialists. Pete Buttigieg had the LGBT vote. Nobody wanted Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. However, Warren and Bernie and even Pete Buttigieg, they're all pretty intelligent, ambitious, determined people. They may have unsound and frankly absurd political philosophies, but if any one of them had become president, it's unlikely that they would have been 100% malleable by the DNC or the FBI or Wall Street or Obama's people or whomever else might have an interest in influencing them. And so it's quite a fortunate coincidence that after losing miserably in Iowa and New Hampshire, Joe Biden's fortune seemed to have turned around completely in South Carolina. Some reporters called it a miracle. It was like magic. But like all magic tricks, there was a lot going on behind the scenes to make the trick happen. Everyone who has an interest in federal politics, every political operative, every activist billionaire, every Wall Street crook, every corrupt federal agent, every power-mad politician in D.C., they're all better off with Biden. Because Biden is, again, by a seemingly magical coincidence, probably the most malleable establishment politician in America. Biden has the resume of a president, but he doesn't have the intellect of one. Even if he was in his prime, with full cognitive function, Biden was never a particularly sharp member of Congress. Biden has always been, to put it bluntly, a phony. He lied about his grades, he's lied about scholarships, he's plagiarized speeches, he's lied about his family history for political gain. His wife even has a phony PhD. But what's worse is that Biden took bribes. His son is compromised. He's compromised. The FBI has Hunter's laptop. We know there's evidence of criminal activity on that laptop, and yet the FBI does nothing. Last December, Hunter announced that he was being investigated by the state of Delaware for tax crimes. What happened to that? We know Biden has taken bribes from foreign agents connected to foreign governments. The money flows through to his son Hunter or to his brother James. If you haven't seen my videos on that stuff, you should check those out. The Biden family is deeply compromised. Now, we're not just talking about scandals that might damage Joe Biden's reputation. We're talking about serious crimes that could land Joe Biden or his family members in prison. And they probably all should be in prison, given the crimes that they've committed. Most people would be in prison. But given the FBI's predilection for using evidence of criminality to blackmail and to control, as opposed to using it to prosecute and to convict, the Bidens have all managed to stay out of prison. And you might think, well, aren't law enforcement folks, military folks, intelligence officers, people like that, aren't all of these people typically conservative? Why would they align with the Democrats? And yeah, I mean, the guys doing the real investigative work, the guys on the ground making arrests, interrogating suspects, bashing in doors, setting up wiretaps, these guys do tend to be conservative. However, the toxic environment established by Robert Mueller created a worst-case scenario for the upper echelon of the FBI. Mueller was a tyrant, and if you didn't tell him exactly what he wanted to hear, you were at risk of a demotion or worse.
If you want to go into supervision, then you raise your hand and you compete and you make that decision. I think this is where the sort of the breakdown in leadership in the Bureau is. That is the beginning of what leads to getting people in executive leadership that you don't want there. The public would not want them there. And these are people that oftentimes are power hungry, or they can't cut it in the field as an agent, or a myriad of other reasons, money, or whatever the case may be. But a lot of times it's not because they want to affect change in the organization or do a better job. It's just because they want more money, more prestige, more power, so on and so forth. But I can tell you from my experience, there weren't many people that I met that really should have been there. Now, that wasn't related to Robert Mueller. That system had been in place prior to Mueller getting there. But I'm telling you that he did create a system that kind of made it worse than it already was.
This kind of work environment pushes out honest men, and it rewards liars and BS artists. And we actually have the same problem with every office that's confirmed by Congress. The problem that we have in DC at the moment is that conservatives have taken a principled position. If you can do the job, regardless of political affiliation, you deserve to be confirmed for a powerful position in government. But Democrats don't think that way. Democrats in Washington believe that anyone who's not a full-blown left-wing activist, well, they should be disqualified from holding any powerful position. And this is why we've seen so many powerful officials spouting woke nonsense over the past year.
The military has included the works of critical race theories on its reading list by authors like Abraham Henry Rogers, who now calls himself Abraham Kendi, and Robin DiAngelo. Mr. Kendi has written, quote, "The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination," end quote. Do you agree with that proposition?
I've not read that, and I don't, I certainly don't agree with what you just said, but
Mr. Secretary.
It's always important to have the full context of anything that you're being asked to evaluate.
Yes or no, do you personally consider the conspiracy that white people started AIDS to be an extremist belief?
Sir, I'd have to understand the context.
That is a simple question.
Are made. I'm not gonna.
Admiral, this is a book that you recommended every sailor in the United States Navy read.
Cherry-picked quotes from somebody's book. I'm not going to do that.
I would also say that diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to this military now, and it will be important in the future. And so we're going to make sure that our military looks like America, and that our leadership looks like what's in the ranks of the military.
Do you personally consider advocating for the destruction of American capitalism to be extremist?
Here's what I know, Congressman.
It's a yes
There's
or no
racism
question,
in the
Admiral.
United States Navy.
Admiral, you recommended every sailor in the United States Navy read this book. It's a yes or no question.
I'm not forcing anybody to read the book. It's on a recommended reading list.
Admiral, did you read the book?
I did.
Okay.
On the issue of critical race theory, I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university. And it is important that we train and we understand, and I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it. On the issue of critical race theory, that was started at Harvard Law School years ago, and it proposed that there were laws in the United States, antebellum laws prior to the Civil War, that led to a power differential with African Americans that were 3/4 of a human being when this country was formed. And then we had a Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation to change it. And we brought it up to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. It took another 100 years to change that. So look I do want to know. And I respect your service, and you and I are both Green Berets. But I want to know. And it matters to our military and the discipline and cohesion of this military.
I do know this. Our strength is in our diversity.
These people have risen up through the ranks because they know exactly which A9 needs licking, and they are more than happy to demean themselves for a teaspoon of power. Now, a lot of people are going to say in the comments, well, the FBI was always corrupt. Just look at J. Edgar Hoover. And yes, J. Edgar Hoover definitely abused his power, clearly. In fact, guess who was good friends with J. Edgar Hoover? The corrupt mayor of Baltimore, Thomas D'Alessandro Jr. Thomas D'Alessandro is the father of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And there's no question, Thomas D'Alessandro was absolutely corrupt. We know this. But he was never prosecuted. And the suspicion is that it's because he was good friends with J. Edgar Hoover. So, was Hoover corrupt? I mean, yeah, that's just one example. But of course he was, of course. However, I'm not sure you can just say that the FBI has always been corrupt every moment of their entire existence. I don't think so. The FBI, although always working in the gray areas of the law in some way or another, I believe has acted primarily in the interests of the American people for much of its existence. As Mark Vines states on his podcast, the FBI used to be aggressively apolitical. It didn't matter if they were investigating a Republican or a Democrat. If you were guilty of a crime, the FBI would do their very best to go after you and take you down. But things have changed. Now, I'm not an FBI historian, and I can't speak on this with an absolute level of certainty, but it seems to me that the FBI began shifting from an apolitical agency to one steeped in political interest on July 19th, 1993. This was when Bill Clinton dismissed FBI Director William S. Sessions, a Reagan appointee. William Sessions had announced that the FBI was going to be investigating DOJ officials. The very next day, Sessions was investigated and ultimately removed for ethics violations related to office perks. Coincidentally, the CFO of the Trump Organization, Alan Weiselberg, was just investigated and ultimately arrested by Democrat officials in the Southern District of New York for, again, office perks. But I digress. Back in the Sessions era, the FBI was, as I said, apolitical. But as the FBI has become more trusted and more influential, it seems to have also become inundated with schemers who are better at navigating the politics of government bureaucracy than running a federal law enforcement bureau. But just as those who are politically savvy and have no integrity are great at securing power in a corrupt bureaucracy and enjoying control over easily manipulated presidents like Joe Biden, so too do they prefer working with other compromised officials and politicians that they can easily manipulate or even control outright. And this is the other reason why I think the FBI has so firmly aligned with the Democrat Party. As much as I'd like to say otherwise, Republicans are not immune from being extorted or tempted. Some Republicans in D.C. have indeed been corrupted, and I imagine that back during the Clinton-Bush years, there may have been some corrupt Republicans in D.C. working with the corrupt Democrats. I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what political party you're aligned with if you're a corrupt politician. All that really matters is that you can keep the cash flowing. However, during the Obama years, something happened that kind of messed things up for corrupt Republicans. The Tea Party movement. The Tea Party aimed to push corrupt establishment Republicans out and bring in new, honest, patriotic Republicans to clean up D.C. And however successful you may think the Tea Party was in their efforts, the movement did one thing very, very well, and that was to scare the hell out of establishment Republicans in Washington. Establishment Republicans got the message. They understood that Republican voters were not interested in crony capitalism, quid pro quo backroom deals, the military-industrial complex, or the cozy relationship between D.C. and Wall Street. And so what I think happened was this. Establishment Republicans who weren't voted out of office were scared straight, at least temporarily. But then the worst happened. Donald Trump was elected president. Now, Republican voters didn't just have a few congressmen fighting for them. We had the president, and Trump could not be bribed. He was too rich, and he couldn't be blackmailed. He was, surprisingly, too clean. Trump was the law and order president. Trump could fight for the American people with zero fear of the corrupt operators in Washington, D.C. And from that point on, any corrupt actors in D.C. knew that there was only one party that they could deal with: the Democrat Party. And this convergence of interest has developed, I believe, into a divided country, into a divided Washington, D.C. Republicans have become the party of law and order, and Democrats, in turn, have fully embraced their destiny as the party of corruption. And because Trump and Trump supporters have proved such a serious threat to the power of these corrupt D.C. operatives, I think the FBI has been given a lot more power than they used to have. And I believe that that is why the FBI is no longer just a law enforcement agency, but it's now an intelligence agency as well. And I also believe that this is why probably all of the intelligence agencies, including the FBI, are totally corrupt. Well, that's it for me. And remember, it's not that our liberal friends are ignorant. It's just that they know so much. That is not so. Good night.
Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation. They say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. That we want our national policy based on what we know in our hearts is morally right.